Little murmurs arose round the table. The moment was well chosen. Everybody was at the breakfast table together for once. Bletchley, his face red, said,
"Mrs. Blenkinsop, that's a very stupid thing to do. It's the movements of soldiers and airmen that are just what the Germans want to know."
"Oh, but I never tell anyone," cried Tuppence, "and I'm very careful never to leave letters around. I always keep them locked up." Bletchley shook his head. It was a grey morning, with the wind blowing coldly from the sea. Tuppence was at the far end of the beach. As she reached the bottom of the cliff, her attention was caught by two figures standing talking a little way up. It was the same fair-haired woman she had seen the day before, and Karl von Deinem. At that moment, the young German turned his head and saw her. Immediately, the two figures parted. The woman came quickly down the hill and crossed the road. Karl von Deinem waited until Tuppence came up to him. Then, politely, he wished her good morning. Tuppence inquired immediately, "Was that a friend you were talking to, Mr. Deinem?" "Not at all," said Karl. "She is Polish, and asked me if I knew a Mrs. Gottlieb she thinks lives near here. I do not, and she says she has perhaps got the name of the house wrong." "I see," murmured Tuppence thoughtfully. Mr. Rosenstein, Mrs. Gottlieb. She felt a growing suspicion about the Polish woman. That evening, before she went to bed, Tuppence pulled out the long drawer of her dressing table. At one side of it was a small box with a cheap lock. Tuppence put on gloves, unlocked the box, and opened it. A pile of letters lay inside. On the top was the one received that morning from Raymond. Tuppence opened it again and frowned. She had placed an eyelash in the fold of the paper this morning. The eyelash was not there now. Somebody was interested in the movements of the British Armed Forces. Who had read her letters? Tuppence thought about it as she lay in bed the following morning. Her thoughts were interrupted by Betty Sproat, who opened the door and ran in. Betty had taken a great liking to Tuppence. She climbed up on the bed and pushed a torn picture book under Tuppence's nose, commanding her to read it. Only she said "weed," as she couldn't pronounce the letter R yet. Tuppence read obediently. "Goosey, goosey gander, whither will you wander? Upstairs, downstairs, in my lady's chamber." Betty rolled about with laughter, repeating in delight, "Upstairs, upstairs, upstairs," and then "down," and rolled off the bed with a thump. This was repeated several times. Then Betty crawled about the floor, playing with Tuppence's shoes and talking busily to herself. "Ugdo-barbit, su-da-put." Then she looked up at Tuppence again and said, "Ugbo-bait, Ugbo-bait." "Lovely, darling," said Tuppence, not knowing what Betty was saying. "Beautiful." Satisfied, Betty started talking to herself again, and Tuppence lay planning what to do next, with Tommy's help. Suddenly, Mrs. Sproat came running in, looking for Betty. "Oh, here she is! Oh, Betty, you naughty girl! Mrs. Blenkinsop, I am so sorry." Tuppence sat up in bed and looked at Betty, who, with an innocent face, had removed the laces from Tuppence's shoes and put them in a glass of water. Tuppence laughed. "How funny! Don't worry, Mrs. Sproat, they'll be okay. It's my fault. I should have noticed what she was doing. She was rather quiet." "I know," Mrs. Sproat sighed. "Whenever they're quiet, it's a bad sign." Mrs. Sproat carried Betty away, and Tuppence got up to put her plan into action. Chapter 6. That day, Mrs. Blenkinsop received a letter from her son Douglas. Mrs. Blenkinsop was so excited that everybody at Sans-Souci heard about it. The letter had not been censored at all, she explained. because one of Douglas's friends coming on leave had brought it, so Douglas had been able to write quite openly. "And it just shows," declared Mrs. Blenkinsop, "how little we really know of what is going on." After breakfast, she went upstairs to her room and put the letter away. Then she went downstairs again. She had already told everyone that she was going up to London for the day to see her lawyer and do a little shopping. And although she had no wish to do so, Mrs. Blenkinsop had said that she was going to London, and to London she must go. It was not until the next day that Tuppence was able to have a meeting with Tommy. Mrs. Blenkinsop met Mr. Meadows as he was taking a walk on the beach. "Well," said Tuppence, "did you see anyone go into my room?" Tommy nodded his head. "The maids went in to clean the room, of course, and Mrs. Perenna went in, but that was when the maids were there. And Betty ran in once and came out with a woolen dog. Anyone else?" "One person," said Tommy slowly. "Carl von Dynam, at lunchtime. He came out from the dining room early, came up to his room, then went across the passage and into yours. He was there about a quarter of an hour. That settles it, I think." Tuppence nodded. Yes, it was quite clear now. Carl von Dynam could have had no reason for going into Mrs. Blenkinsop's bedroom and remaining there for a quarter of an hour, except for one. "I'm sorry," she said slowly. "So am I," said Tommy. "He's a nice boy." "Well, I think we can agree that Carl von Dynam is working with Sheila and her mother," said Tuppence. "Probably Mrs. Perenna is in charge, and that foreign woman who was talking to Carl yesterday must be involved somehow." "What do we do now?" Tommy asked. "We must search Mrs. Perenna's room, and we must follow her and see where she goes and who she meets. Tommy, let's get Albert down here." Many years ago, Albert, who had worked in a hotel, had helped the young Beresfords. Afterwards, he had gone to work for them as a general servant. 6 years ago, he had married and was now the proud owner of the Duck and Dog, a pub in South London. Tuppence continued quickly. "Albert will be really excited. He can stay at the pub near the station, and he can follow the Perennas for us, or anyone else." "What about Mrs. Albert?" "She has gone to her mother's in Wales with the children because of possible air raids on London. It all fits in perfectly." "Yes, that's a good idea, Tuppence. Albert will be perfect. Now, another thing. I think we ought to watch out for that so-called Polish woman who was talking to Carl. She probably comes here for orders or to take messages. Next time we see her, one of us must follow her and find out more about her." Tommy continued his walk and entered the post office where he phoned Mr. Grant. Then he wrote and sent a letter to Albert and bought himself a newspaper. He was walking back to Sans-Souci when Commander Haydock, passing in his car, shouted, "Hello, Meadows! Want a lift?" Tommy got in gratefully. "So you read that awful newspaper, do you?" demanded Haydock, looking at the red cover of the Inside Weekly News. "It's terrible," Tommy agreed, "but sometimes they do seem to know what's going on behind the scenes." "The truth of it is," said Commander Haydock, just missing a large van, "when they're right, you remember it, and when they're wrong, you forget it. Do you feel like a game of golf tomorrow? I've got to go to a meeting about this parachute business, getting together a group of local volunteers. Good idea, if you ask me. So, will we have a round of golf about 6? "Thanks very much." "Good, then that's agreed." The commander stopped abruptly at the gate of Sans-Souci. "How's the fair Sheila?" he asked. "Quite well, I think. I haven't seen much of her." Haydock gave his loud laugh. "Not as much as you'd like to, I bet. She's a good-looking girl, but she sees too much of that German fellow. Unpatriotic, I call it." Mr. Meadows said, "Be careful. He's just coming up the hill behind us." "I don't care if he does here.
Any decent Germans fighting for his country, not running over here to avoid it.
Chapter 7. On the following day, Mrs. Sproat went up to London. Various residents of Sans-Souci had offered to look after Betty, and Tuppence had the morning turn.
"Play,"
said Betty.
"play hide-seek."
She was talking more easily every day, and had adopted a most attractive habit of putting her head on one side with a lovely smile and murmuring,
"Peas."
which was her way of saying please. Tuppence had intended to take her for a walk, but it was raining, so the two of them went into Mrs. Sproat's bedroom. Betty led the way to the drawer of the bureau where her toys were kept. "Shall we hide Bonzo?" asked Tuppence. But Betty had changed her mind, and demanded instead,
"Read me story."
Tuppence pulled out a book, only to be interrupted by a cry from Betty.
No, bad."
Tuppence stared at her in surprise, and then down at the book, which was a coloured version of Little Jack Horner. "Was Jack a bad boy?" she asked, "because he pulled out a plum?"
"Bad,"
Betty said, and then, with a huge effort,
"nasty."
She took the book from Tuppence and put it back, then took out an identical book from the other end of the shelf, saying with a huge smile,
"Clean, nice, Jack Corner."
Tuppence realised that any dirty, well-read books had been replaced by new and cleaner ones. Mrs. Sproat was always terrified of germs. Tuppence had brought up her own two children in contact with a reasonable amount of dirt. However, she took the clean copy of Jack Horner and read it to the child, followed by another, Goosey Goosey Gander. Then Betty hid the books, and Tuppence took an amazingly long time to find each of them, to Betty's great delight, and so the morning passed quickly. After lunch, Betty had her rest, and it was then that Tuppence looked out into the garden and saw that the rain had stopped. At the bottom of the garden, the bushes parted slightly. In the gap, a face appeared. It was the Polish woman staring up at the windows of Sans-Souci. The woman's face had no expression, and yet there was something frightening about it. Turning abruptly from the window, Tuppence ran downstairs, out of the front door, and down the path at the side of the house to where she had seen the woman. There was no one there now. Tuppence went through the bushes and out onto the road and looked up and down the hill. She could see no one. Troubled, she turned and went back into Sans-Souci. Could she have imagined the whole thing? No, the woman had been there. She felt a strange sense that something bad was going to happen. Now that the weather had improved, Miss Minton was taking Betty out for a walk. They were going down to the town to buy a toy duck to sail in Betty's bath. Betty was very excited, and the two set off together, Betty saying happily,
Buy a duck, for Betty Bath, for Betty Bath."
2 matchsticks left crossed on the marble table in the hall was the code that told Tuppence that Mr. Meadows was spending the afternoon following Mrs. Perenna. Tuppence went to the lounge and sat with Mr. and Mrs. Cayley. Mr. Cayley was unhappy. He had come to Leahampton, he explained, for rest and quiet. And what quiet could there be with a child in the house? All day long she was screaming and running about, jumping up and down. His wife murmured that Betty was really a dear little girl, but the comment only annoyed him more.
No doubt, said Mr. Cayley, but her mother should keep her quiet. There are other people to consider. Invalids, people who need to rest.
Quickly, Tuppence changed the subject. I wish you would tell me your views on life in Germany. You've travelled there several times, and it would be interesting to have your point of view. Mr. Cayley smiled.
Dear lady, in my opinion.
Tuppence, murmuring an occasional, Now that's very interesting, listened with close attention. She was quickly convinced that Mr. Cayley was an admirer of the Nazi system. He clearly thought, though he did not say it openly, how much better it would have been if England and Germany had taken sides against the rest of Europe. Nearly 2 hours later, they were interrupted by the return of Miss Minton, Betty, and the duck. Looking up, Tuppence caught a strange expression on Mrs. Cayley's face. It might have been simply a wife's jealousy at her husband paying so much attention to another woman. It might have been concern that Mr. Cayley was speaking too clearly about his political views. It certainly expressed dissatisfaction. Tea came next, and soon after that came the return of Mrs. Sproat from London, exclaiming, "I do hope Betty's been good." Mrs. Sproat then sat down, drank several cups of tea, and spoke excitedly about what she had bought in London, the crowd on the train, what a soldier recently returned from France had told the people in her train carriage, and what a girl in a shop had told her of shortages to come. The conversation was, in fact, completely normal. It went on afterwards on the terrace outside, for the sun was now shining. Betty rushed happily about, going into the bushes and returning with a leaf or little stones, which she placed in the lap of one of the grown-ups. She would give an explanation in her own little language, which no one could understand, of what they represented. Fortunately, she required little response in her game, being satisfied with an occasional, "How nice, darling, is it really?" There had never been an evening more typical of Sans-Souci. There was talk about the war. Can France fight back? What is Russia likely to do? Could Hitler invade England if he tried? Will Paris fall to the Germans? Suddenly, Mrs. Sproat glanced at her watch. "Goodness, it's nearly 7. I ought to have put that child to bed ages ago. Betty! Betty!" It was some time since Betty had returned to the terrace, though no one had really noticed. Mrs. Sproat called her with growing impatience. "Betty! Where can the child be?" Mrs. O'Rourke said with her deep laugh,
"Doing something naughty, I've no doubt about it. It's always the way when there's quiet."
"Betty, I want you." There was no answer, and Mrs. Sproat rose impatiently. "I suppose I must go and look for her. I wonder where she can be." Miss Minton suggested that she was hiding somewhere, but Betty could not be found, either inside or outside the house. They went round the garden calling, and they looked in all the bedrooms. There was no Betty anywhere. Mrs. Sproat began to get annoyed. "It's very naughty of her, very naughty indeed. Do you think she could have gone out on the road?" Together, she and Tuppence went out to the gate and looked up and down the hill. There was no one in sight except a delivery boy with a bicycle standing talking to a maid at the door of the house across the road. Tuppence and Mrs. Sproat crossed the road, and Mrs. Sproat asked if either of them had seen a little girl. The maid asked, "A little girl in a green dress?" Mrs. Sproat replied eagerly, "That's right. I saw her about half an hour ago, going down the road with a woman." Mrs. Sproat said with amazement, "With a woman? What sort of a woman?" The girl seemed slightly embarrassed. "Well, what I'd call a strange-looking woman. I'm sure she was foreign. She was wearing strange clothes, like a kind of shawl, and no hat. Her face was strange, too. I've seen her about once or twice lately, and to tell the truth, I thought she was a bit mad."